Hey, um, these days, basically, my mind is absolutely absorbed by two subjects. That is Floyd Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao tomorrow night, and the British general election. So all night I've been watching boxing videos, just watch Pacquiao Rios and so on. But anyway, I don't want to bore non-boxing fans. This is a political video, and it's about Ed Miliband and Russell Brand. Um, if you haven't heard of Russell Brand and you're British, I would be surprised. He's one of our most famous people right now. He's a comedian and sort of a social campaigner, and he's very outspoken on issues of what he perceives to be unfairness in this country. Um, he has attracted considerable notoriety with some of his comments, insofar as he encouraged young people not to vote, and also he's become something of a target of ridicule from the right-wing press, not surprising because he holds very left-wing views. He's sort of like a modern-day John Lennon. And people might laugh at that, but it's he's probably the closest equivalent we have when you think about it. Anyway, I find Russell Brand quite an interesting man. I certainly couldn't find myself connecting with him because I do believe in the political system, not necessarily as it is now, but I'm not an anarchist. Um, Maybe it's unfair to say that he is, but also I'm a lot more centrist than Russell Brand, whereas he would be much more to the left. However, this was an interesting interview. He's been interviewing other party leaders. I'm not going to talk so much about them because really, the Greens and Russell Brand are going to be on the same boat, so I don't think that's particularly interesting. But with Ed Miliband, that's more interesting because Ed Miliband has a real chance of becoming Prime Minister, whereas Natalie Bennett doesn't, nor does Nigel Farage. And I haven't seen the UKIP interview that, I can't imagine they're going to get anywhere with that one. Because, couldn't be more different. But um, this interview with Ed Miliband was, well, of course, the Sun has ridiculed it because, they have an ongoing smear campaign against Ed Miliband and an ongoing ridicule campaign against Russell Brand. So, what you expect. Um, Firstly, I think Ed Miliband deserves credit for reaching out to Russell Brand. Russell Brand even insinuated that he appreciated that. But anyway, to the conversation, the interview itself, what Russell Brand was explaining was that, in his opinion, a lot of people are put off politics because they believe that their vested interests are very powerful and they have the Conservative Party uh, shackled and they have the Conservative Party on strings. These vested interests, multinationals, the banking sector, and so on. In his view, that there is an elite that is controlling this country, and people feel no matter who is elected, it will make no difference. So that's how Russell Brand was explaining why there is. Actually, he didn't want to use the word apathy. He said he described it another way. I can't remember how he described it. He resented the term apathy because he said actually, and the thing is, it is important to know that there's a difference between apathy and actually Russell Brand isn't apathetic. He's incredibly political, even if he wouldn't necessarily admit it himself. Um, there is two different things. You get people who just can't be bothered, and it's not necessarily that they're angry or um, they feel pissed off. It's that they genuinely cannot be bothered. They're just not interested. They prefer to watch X Factor. Um, but then there's people like Russell Brand and the people who support him who are angry with the system and who a lot of the people who support him would be borderline anarchist. And, I'm not saying that in a nasty way. I'm just saying that because it would be quite accurate. Anarchists in the sense that they believe it's all corrupt and there's no point. Now, Russell Brand got a lot of criticism for saying that people should don't vote, and I understand that criticism. I share that criticism because I think it was an irresponsible thing to do. The thing is, Russell Brand actually does make a lot of good points. Leave aside the fact that he's a comedian, leave aside the fact that he's slightly eccentric. he actually does make a lot of fair points. And I think most reasonable minded people could see that a lot of things he talks about, forget um, some of the positions he has. Let's just look at the basic issues of fairness. What he's saying, I think a very significant portion of the population could agree with, because there was significant anger over banking bonuses. There was significant anger over overseas tax havens, and so on and so on. Now, all Russell Brand is doing is touching on those things. People have criticised the guy because he himself is a millionaire. So I guess the insinuation there is that he's a hypocrite. But I don't quite buy that because, I mean, it's sort of like saying if you're a successful person in whatever field you're successful in his case it's comedy, should you therefore have no social conscience and should you just shut up? I don't think that's really. I mean, I'm for example, I'm a very ambitious person. That might well be that I make a lot of money out of, for example, I'm a writer. I might get my book published and make a lot of money. Does that mean I'm suddenly going to not have a social conscience? Of course not. So I think it's a little bit unfair to attack him for that. As long as he's not breaking any laws, as long as he's paying his tax, then I don't think it's really a fair point to attack him on. Although the point about encouraging people not to vote, I do think that's very, very irresponsible. And the interesting thing about this interview is, in the wake of it, as far as I know, he's come out and said he's going to support Ed Miliband now. So he's somewhat reversed his position on that. But the interview, if you get a chance to see it, is very interesting. Like I say, he makes this point that people feel that politicians are only in it for vested interests. Now, that irritates me when people come out with statements like that, especially someone who's in a public position. Maybe that's his genuine opinion, but I think it's irresponsible because it's just unfair. It's unfair to insinuate that most politicians campaign their ass off, and they are on a much much lower wage than Mr. Brand, um, just because they want to serve the Murdoch empire. I think that's unfair. I think it's a distortion of the picture. Maybe it's true enough within the Tory party, but I suspect there's even many Conservative MPs who are fed up with Rupert Murdoch and the shacklehold he has on this country. Um, I really, call me old-fashioned, but I really do believe the majority of politicians in this country get into politics for the right reasons. It doesn't mean that their policies are necessarily progressive, but I really don't believe that the majority of people go into politics because they want to be cronies of big multinationals. I'm not naive. I'm not saying there aren't people who can definitely be categorized that way. I'm sure there are, but I've met a number of politicians directly, and that really wasn't the impression I got. Um, and I would come back to the point about putting this in context to other situations around the world. Now, I appreciate that it's not enough to say, "Oh, we're much better than other places, therefore we shouldn't complain." I'm not suggesting that for a second, but I do think sometimes it would do us well to put things in context and recognize just how far we have come. Now, when Russell Brand in the beginning of the interview said basically there's been no progress at all since women got the vote, I'm very pleased Miliband took him up on that because it is absolutely rubbish. Absolutely rubbish. And I think towards the end, Russell Brand conceded that. I will give Russell Brand his credit. He's not arrogant. He will step back when, he realizes he's been caught out on something, on a point. I don't think he's arrogant. I do think he's humble enough to admit when he's wrong. But he was wrong about that. I mean, to say that there's been no progressive policies since 1918 is incredibly willfully ignorant. And for him as a public figure to say that, I'm so pleased that Ed Miliband took him up on that. I mean, the sheer amount of legislation is incredible. Um, okay, if we look at votes for women as a starting point, if we look at it in its full form, 1928, actually, that's when all women got suffrage. The creation of the NHS, which Brand acknowledged was a good thing. The abolition of the death penalty under the Wilson administration, and the decriminalisation of homosexuality, the ban on fox hunting, the ban on smoking in public places. I know not everyone agrees with that, but it has saved the NHS billions. Um, the list goes on and on and on. That's just a few things that I've mentioned there. Um, Peace in Northern Ireland. There's a wide range of other things. Is the situation perfect? Far from it. I mean, Mr. Miliband is talking about zero hours contracts. I'm disappointed the Labour Party still won't talk about workfare. I want them to make a commitment to abolish workfare. I don't think that's radical. I don't think it's extreme. I think workfare is an abomination, and abolishing it is common sense. It's reasonable because it's a field approach to unemployment, basically forcing unemployed people to do unpaid work. To my mind, that is even worse than zero hours contract. Now, it does show me the Labour Party has its moral compass in the right place by focusing on zero hours contracts. Although I don't like the rhetoric they're using about hardworking families, hardworking families. I'm a little bit put off by that because I feel that's feeding into a sort of divisive lingo of the working people versus the unemployed, and it's not that different from the sort of language the Tories use. But I do believe that Miliband has his moral compass in the right place overall. I don't agree with the Labour Party in everything. I certainly don't agree with the militant feminism, which is not about equality. I've made my views very clear on that. I'm not going to get into it in this video. There's a lot of areas I don't agree with Labour on, but I've never had personal animosity towards Mr. Miliband. I think he's a decent man, and I think over the last few months he has shown he is capable of being a prime minister. But a few final thoughts about this exchange. Um, when Russell Brand says that people feel disillusioned, I do understand where he's coming from because people do feel that they are powerless when you consider, for example, the power of the Murdoch Empire. But actually, there is civic responsibility involved in this. And Miliband was right to say that the power that they have is less than it once was. I mean, the Sun's readership has went down by 1 million people. That is pretty significant. Now, you might say, well, all the print presses went down, which is true, but nevertheless, it is true to say their influence is significantly less than it was. That is a good thing. It's a very good thing. Also, when he spoke about the thing is, a lot of the points of contention that Russell Brand has is actually on the Labour Party manifesto. For example, his issue with one man owning 34% of the media. Well, the Labour Party is pushing to break up the Murdoch empire and make it like 15% or 10%. Personally, I think the limit should be about 15%. I wouldn't have it absolutely so it's like, one person couldn't have any influence. I think that would be unrealistic. But also, I like the fact that Miliband came across as very statesmanlike. He didn't just give a sort of hard left. He didn't just tell Russell Brand what he wanted to hear. I like the realist tones of what Ed Miliband was saying, and both of them touched on the fact that you don't want a politician who's promising the earth. And I think part of the problem with Obama mania, and also to some extent the Blair euphoria, was that it sort of gives the public. I think what's happened in the last 5 years, because of the series of high-profile scandals that we've had, the British public are a lot more wary of any sense of excitement. That's why we are in a situation where no party is commanding overall trust. It's completely understandable. I think we're actually in a very interesting period politically. It's an interesting time because on the surface you might think the British are very cynical on. I mean, as an observer, as someone interested in politics and a voter and a British citizen, sometimes I'm tempted to think, oh, my countrymen and women are so cynical. But actually, if we look at, for example, turnout in the Scottish referendum, and slightly changing the issue here, but that was massive. Now, I actually suspect turnout in this election will be high. And that is always a good thing. When there is high turnout, that is a good thing. Now, I hope Russell Brand will reflect on this interview, and he doesn't have to agree with everything Ed Miliband is saying, but I hope he will reflect on the fact that it is absolutely the case that the only way you change things is by directly engaging in the democratic system. It's all very well to say that people feel disillusioned and the system is rotten, and there's vested interests, there's this powerful elite. But, what is the point of giving up? The only way that changes is through legislation. Ed Miliband is 100% correct by saying that. People can denounce politicians and say they're only in it for themselves. And another point I would make, when people say that it's the people that make decisions, well, I have to say personally, I'm uneasy with this constant trying to stir up this gulf between politicians and people, and a lot of people do that. Journalists, celebrities, and even politicians themselves, like the politicians and the people. Look, I'm going to say something here that might sound mad, but politicians are people, and actually, we have got to an extent in our historic timeline where most of the people actually, um, okay, I shouldn't say most, but a significant number of people in Parliament do come from normal backgrounds. There are 75 veterans in the, I think it's either 65 or 75 veterans, former soldiers who are serving MPs. There are former doctors. There are, within the Labour Party, you've had all sorts of people who are now MPs. So I think it's unfair to say that it's this class of politicians versus the public. I really think that's a distortion. On the other hand, it is true that you get political insiders who, from a very young age, have been, researchers for MPs and so on and so on. I would make a point, though. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it's necessarily just because someone has been a parliamentary researcher, it doesn't mean that they're going to be a bad MP. And I think it's a little bit unfair to say that because someone has had experience of Westminster, then that makes them unqualified and makes them out of touch. I think that's unfair. I mean, you could argue that it's important to have experience, to know how it works on a day-to-day basis. I mean, the public really need to make their mind up what do they want. And I really think the best situation is if you have this diverse range of people. And I really don't think it's a problem if some people do have inside experience at Westminster. Because experience is a good thing. It's like if you're applying for a job, you're going to get the job if you have experience. Well, likewise, yes, it is great that politicians have real world experience. They've done other jobs, that's great. But just because someone has been inside, I don't think that should disqualify them. I don't think it means that they don't have empathy, and I don't think it means that they've never suffered in their life. Let's be fair here. I suspect that most politicians have life stories that are just as up and down as the rest of us. Let's just be fair in our reflections on this, because I really do think sometimes the British public let their cynicism actually blind them to common sense. Um, I mean, it's absolutely true that a lot of the frustration people feel is entirely justified. I've been there. I have felt deep anger when I see massive banking bonuses and I see, for example, unemployed people being penalised, sometimes driven to suicide, and then these fat cats in the city seemingly getting off the hook. And there's even a sense that large segments of the media even respect that culture a lot more than they. I mean, for example, the Murdoch press would talk about Mr. Diamond, the banking executive, and in the same page they would talk about Dole scum found, cheating his or her benefits. So there is definitely a discrepancy, and there is definitely a very powerful elite in this country in terms of a large segment of the City of London, a large segment of the media, and a large segment of other institutions. But what Ed Miliband said was also correct. You can't banks in themselves are not a bad thing. You need banks in a society. So banks in themselves are not a bad thing. But it is about perception of fairness. That is what the public respond to. And David Cameron and his Conservative colleagues can talk as much as they want about the economy recovering and so on. But the fact of the matter is, most people see this country as being deeply unfair. And what the Murdoch press are doing um, is launching a smear campaign against Ed Miliband and his party because they are part of that institution. They are part of the elite that's Then again, if we want to be really comprehensive about this, you could argue the BBC is part of the elite, and there's many who would accuse the BBC of being left wing. So I'm not sure if this is necessarily a left wing, right wing thing. I think it's more to do with who has the power. And I think what Russell Brand was getting at is the fact that I think what he was touching on is politicians don't have the real power in this country. And in that sense, he does make a fair point, if that's what he's suggesting. Anyway, I've talked for a long time here, so my final thoughts are, I don't think not voting is responsible. I can understand if you have a ballot and you genuinely disagree with the people on the ballot. That's why I support the introduction of none of the above, so that people have that extra choice, as long as people vote. You need to be part of the democratic system because I've mentioned this in previous videos. Suffragettes and Chartists suffered for this. Our democracy, imperfect as it is, to get to this level, I mean, you can't comprehend how far we have come in light of what we were in the past and how better we are compared to many other parts of the world in terms of the choice that we have. I was speaking to a Chinese guy tonight, and he was fascinated by our political system. I was explaining the basics of it, that we have a choice between parties and so on. And he was fascinated. And I could tell by his body language that he was really fascinated by this. And it's not the first time I've seen this. A Syrian friend of mine a while back, again, he said in his country this would be unthinkable that different political factions can argue with each other and even throw petty insults, and it wouldn't end up in bloodshed. Obviously, Syria is in a quagmire right now. So sometimes I do think that we need to really think about things in context. Our system's far from perfect, and there are many big, big questions that need to be answered about where power lies and so on. But personally, I'm not entirely cynical about the whole system. I don't think it is all rotten. I do think that people can be empowered, and I'm cautiously optimistic. It's never going to be perfect, but we can be better. We can. So I agree with a lot of what Ed Miliband is saying there. Doesn't mean I agree with everything his party is saying, but I agree with the principles of what he is saying. I'd particularly like to hear from people who are maybe apathetic or they completely agree with Russell Brand. What do you make of that interview? Let me know your thoughts.